Hey guys, I'm here now to talk to you about total war. All right, so let's see if we can get this done. All right, total war. Oh, if I don't lose an eyeball, I'll be lucky. All right, total war. The concept of total war is kind of what it sounds like, right? It involves the sides that are fighting the war devoting everything in their country towards winning the war. That means not just soldiers, but also things like your economy, right? Everyone at home who wasn't involved in the fighting was involved with helping with the fighting, producing things that the soldiers needed. That meant women, that meant children, people who had not typically been at work were forced to go to work. It also included the elderly who were forced to go back to work as well. It also meant, in terms of total war, that your enemy was trying to defeat your entire society, your total society. So that meant that your enemy was not just focused on making your soldiers lose the battle, they were focused on making sure that your society suffered as well. And you can see that in an example such as the one that we brought up last time with the British putting the blockade around the German ports, trying to stop the German people, the German citizens, from getting food, medicine, supplies that they needed, right? That's an example of total war. So it really involved all aspects of your society, both contributing to your team winning and towards contributing to the other team losing, right? To that effect, there were really two elements to total war. There was the military front, those are your soldiers doing the actual fighting, and what was called the home front. Those are the people who are not fighting, but are rather in your home country, helping your soldiers to win the fight. And the quote here from the United States president at the time, whose name was Woodrow Wilson, says that the people who are involved with producing for the soldiers are just as valuable to the fight as the soldiers themselves. How did total war change the societies that were involved in the war? They changed the societies by doing a couple of things that had never really been done to such a great extent before. One, a military draft. Typically in the past, militaries were either made up of volunteers or people who were trained and professionally paid as soldiers. Using a draft was something that was somewhat unusual, but they did so for a couple of reasons. One, to make sure that they had a consistent supply of soldiers, because by the time that the middle of this war rolled around, it started in 1914, so let's say at about 1916, people started to feel quite differently about the war. They were enthusiastic and happy about the war in the beginning, but when they started to hear about things like the Battle of the Somme, for example, people turned against the war quite quickly. They did not want to go fight, basically just to die. So they had to get soldiers somehow. And second reason was they wanted to make sure that those people that would be especially valuable to their society, scientists, engineers, managers, other such people, that they aren't going out and joining the fight. So the draft gave the government some measure of control over who was going, right? Speaking about government control, the governments in each country involved in the fighting more or less took complete control of the economy. So instead of your business owners deciding who to hire and what to make and what to pay people, the government took almost complete control of that. The government told companies what to make, and they told them how much of it to make. They told the companies who to hire, how many people to hire, and how much to pay them. The government really took complete control of all businesses, especially those businesses that were involved in making things that would be useful to the war effort. They were also involved in things like rationing, right? Rationing is limiting how much of something you can buy or when you're able to buy it. So things like food especially were rationed. Citizens, people who were not fighting, would be able to only buy a limited amount of, say, bread or coffee or meat because they needed to make sure that they had enough to provide their soldiers with as well. And then the use of propaganda. Propaganda is a fairly complicated thing to understand sometimes, but the best way to probably describe it is using media to convince people to believe certain things, usually things that are only half true or perhaps not true at all, and it's especially used during times of war. So propaganda during World War I really had two purposes. One, to hide the truth from your people when it would hurt them. So for example, instead of allowing the news to tell people the truth about how many people were dying, maybe they would say, or the government would step in and say, look, you can't tell the people that, you need to lie. You need to say fewer people died or not bring it up at all so that people wouldn't be so upset. And the second way propaganda was used was to make you hate your enemy all the more. The people who were fighting in this war were typically normal people, right? A British soldier was typically a normal British person. A German soldier was typically a normal German person. There was nothing about who they were that made them especially evil, right? But it's not easy to go out and start shooting at people who are just like you. So your government had to make you believe that these people you were fighting against weren't even worthy of being called people. The government used things like propaganda to make it seem like your enemy was truly an evil monster who needed to be defeated. So how did the war affect people at home? How did it affect the home front? Well, like we said in the beginning, people were enthusiastic about the war, but by the time the middle of the war rolled around, 1916, people started to get quite upset about the war. And one way that they took out their anger was to protest and to go on strike. You see here two of the biggest examples of strikes that happened during World War I. In 1916, 50,000 German workers held a strike for 3 days in protest of the war. A year later, that number quadruples in Germany as well. You have a strike of 200,000 people for a period of time that doubles in length. Instead of 3 days, they're going on strike for a week. This would be devastating to the country in which this happens. If all these people, 50,000 and then 200,000, just stopped making things for the war for that amount of time, even though it seems short, that's a massive amount of stuff that could be produced in that amount of time. If you take 200,000 people who are making bullets and they don't make bullets for a week, you could very well run out of bullets, right? So those are going to be major issues for countries to deal with. And how did they deal with them? Well, the governments during wartime were quite harsh on their people. When protests happened, the police were generally violent with the protesters, making sure that they were shut down as fast as possible. And the governments also went out of their way to make sure that your freedom as a citizen was limited, even in those countries that typically believed in giving you freedom, like England and France, countries that were quite similar to the United States. They made it illegal to speak your mind about the war. For example, in England, they passed a law called the Defense of the Realm Act that allowed you to be arrested if you protested and charged with treason, right? Treason is a crime that carries the death penalty, right? So they used these rather harsh measures to intimidate people in a way that would stop them from speaking their mind. In terms of how it affected society in the long run, the changes that were brought on because of total war made unemployment during the war almost disappear. Every single person could be found to help the country in some way or another, whether you were fighting or whether you were making things for the fight. The government found something for you to do. And this especially affected women who had in the past, before the war, been excluded from many different types of professions. You see here, in the single industry of banking, right? Women were not really represented in that profession before the war. But during the war, their numbers rose significantly from 9,500 to 64,000 women in the banking industry. In England alone, there were 1.3 million new jobs for women. However, unfortunately, after the war, when the men returned from being soldiers, many of these women were fired by their governments in order to make room for the men coming back, and the women that were kept on typically saw their wages drop. One thing that women did get, though, and this really couldn't be ignored, was the right to vote in most of the countries that were involved in the war. Women had served their countries so strongly and so admirably that the governments of these countries really couldn't ignore their request to be given the right to vote, to participate in democracy. So you see, after the war, England's going to give women the right to vote in 1918, Germany and Austria as well, and soon after the war, the United States will give women the right to vote too. So there you have it. That's total war, involving every element of your society in either the combat, the fighting directly, or in supporting the combat. So we have one more video left that's going to deal with the peace process. Haven't read about that yet. We're going to talk about it in this video. You're going to have it in the slides, which we're going to post online. All right. See you then.